cultural conflict? And the answer there is probably not. That was at one point kind of the dream, if you will, in the late 1900s. But it was a dream at that time of a Protestant majority that said, well, if we can kind of educate Catholics and Jews into our vision, which oftentimes had a kind of religious overtone to it, then it will have this unified culture. What's important since then is that there are unitary aspects of American culture, but there continue to be these cleavages. So conflict, cultural conflict, won't fully disappear if part of it has to do with changes in the social makeup of the United States, changes in religious groups, changes in ethnic groups, and that sort of thing, that may have different visions of what the common good is. Let's see. And I guess another kind of quite clear reason why cultural conflict might not be eradicated by education is because public education in itself is undergoing huge transformations in this country. Many people, kind of what we might call in the Orthodox camp, have moved towards the homeschooling movement or the private school movement, especially kind of Christian or particularly religious schools. And they've done overtly because they say, hey, in those public schools, those are dominated, so they say, by secularists or atheistic humanists is the terms that they use. Oftentimes there's not a whole lot of evidence for these arguments, but they'll argue and say, we'll lose the culture war if we send our children to those educational institutions, and so therefore we're going to keep them out of those and educate them in a parallel track, which assures at some level that the differences in the vision of the good will continue and conflict will happen. I didn't write down who asked this, but somebody asked, well, yes, but isn't conflict natural? Isn't this just always going to happen? Well, as I've said before, it does seem at one level that conflict, if you will, quote unquote, is natural if we talk about the basis of conflict in different social groups, changes in power distributions, and also different visions of the common good. But there are some moments that aren't that conflictual. If you think about immediately after World War II, just kind of people talk about kind of the rosy golden era of there being kind of coherence and the lack of conflict. Though often, as we found out with that era, the lack of conflict is due oftentimes to the suppression of conflict. So then in the late 1950s and 1960s, we get various anti-war, civil rights, women's movements, and that sort of thing. And so that becomes kind of a key moment of conflict. But an important thing of this is that conflict is generated both by inequalities in the social system, but also by coming to perceive inequalities and then generating. So in the 1980s and early 1990s, many kind of fundamentalist and conservative Christian religious groups were mobilized to see by many political actors to see that their religious visions were being challenged and being lost in the United States, and so that they should bring conflict up, bring it back, engage in the political process in order to protect their vision of the good. Interesting is that the reasons why people conflict or mobilize for political conflict can change. So whereas Hunter said at an earlier era, this conflict was between these different religious traditions and was on the local level, in 1990 he writes and says, no, now it's between these different moral visions and it's taken on a national flavor. It's played out at a national level. So because the bases of conflict have changed before, then we would expect that while conflict might not go away, the bases of conflict could change again. For example, Samuel Huntington has written a lot over the last 20 years to try and argue that the conflict is really about, it's between what he calls quote unquote kind of core or Euro-Americans and other ethnic groups or other ethno-religious groups that have immigrated to the United States. So he's trying to draw lines of conflict on national identity and kind of religio-racial backgrounds. And we haven't seen that that's become the main conflict, though it seems to have amped up a bit with a lot of the press coverage of Mexican violence, which is interesting because there's been drug violence going on both sides of the border for quite a while. But interestingly, in a down economic time, we see kind of an upsurge in the coverage of that violence because also in a down economic time, there's oftentimes more anxiety and oftentimes more overt violence against immigrants. And so the coverage recently, especially of Mexican violence, kind of plays in to kind of increased conflict around that kind of idea of kind of natural nationality exclusion that has to do with differences in national identity and racial and religious background. So conflict is natural in the sense that it often happens because of inequalities that are in a social system, but it's not natural in the sense that groups have to be mobilized into it and the bases of conflict change over time. So let me kind of leave it at that and say that you guys have done a good job with this culture war argument. For Thursday, you're going to be taking a look at a chapter from this, a short reading which from the Pew Foundation, and a chapter from this, which is these authors headed by Morris Fiorina. Let's see, when's this written? This is written in 2006, where he says, really? Is there a culture war? Because by 2006, this idea had been floating around for more than 15 years and driving a lot of political discussion. And these authors marshal a whole bunch of data to say, maybe this whole culture war thing doesn't hold water. Maybe there isn't a culture war. So more on that in the next lecture. Good luck on the quiz tomorrow, and hope you continue to do well. Bye-bye. I'm going to build my definition of religion piece to piece. And then understand that Durkheim is doing a couple things. When he was writing at this time, there was very little sociological research about religion. So he was at the beginning of the founding of sociology. And because he was also fighting against psychologists and historians, saying they can understand religion in their own ways, but I'm a sociologist and I'm going to understand it in a particularly sociological way. So keep that in mind. The other thing is he talks about magic in this reading. Now, what he's talking about there basically is he's talking about in primitive societies, kind of the shamans that may use magic in very particular ways to try and heal somebody.